as a way of starting, I had to take a look at the title in terms of what it is. And the title is one that already is one I find very frustrating as the person who chose it. And that's really trying to look at this notion of understanding the Torah through its contradictions. So I thought as a matter of starting off there, when I say Torah, what comes to mind? What do we mean by Torah? It's such an obvious one, right?
5 books of Moses.
Okay, so we've got over here our 5 books. All right, and we'll credit Moses. What do we mean by Torah?
Halakha.
Halakha?
Yeah.
Okay, and by halakha you meaning?
Sorry?
By halakha you mean?
I mean in terms of like how the Torah defines our way of life.
Okay, so on the one hand, halakha is the term for Jewish law, because I'm not going to presume.
But it's extracted from the Tanakh.
Wow, so now we've got, I heard you say lifestyle,
Yes.
and now I'm hearing you say Tanakh.
Yes.
Great, as long as we're clear on exactly what you mean by Torah, this is perfect, yeah?
Word of God.
Word of God. All right, what does that mean?
Well, it means that God talked to the Jewish people and gave them a way of living and commandments.
So for those of you in Purim Spiels, here's the Jewish script from Sinai, right?
Right.
So many of us, I assume, are some way connected to a Purim Spiel at the moment. We handed a script. This is the script we're giving at Mount Sinai, God's word handed to us. Anything else?
Learning.
Learning. What do you mean by that?
That you argue about things.
And the Jewish community, we don't know what that means. So this is just our platform for a good argument. All right. Anyone else? Is it
Like the whole corpus of Jewish traditions.
Oh, yeah. So, Jewish corpus of traditions.
Corpus of Jewish traditions.
Okay. There we go. I'm going to let my left-handed handwriting get the better of everyone, yeah? Wonderful. Okay, you've just all confused me, so thank you very much. My question very simply is, we talk about contradictions of Torah, but I think it's very common that it's a word that the Jewish community takes for granted, but I've never yet found consensus as to what it means. And when we do find consensus, they're the people that I think Clive describes as boring, because there's something very problematic going on there. How many of you feel that someone here has got the right answer?
I like
Stories? Yeah. Anyone else answer that someone else said that you may be resonating with a bit more as you've read it?
I would have limited to the 5 books of Moses, that's the Torah.
Okay.
That's, the rest is just thoughts, but it's not the Torah.
So for you, this is the headline, and this might be what's within it.
Superficial.
Okay. Anyone else? I'm going to start off with, again, saying I have no answers for you, but it's worth saying that the word Torah itself is our first contradiction, because there's literally no agreement throughout Jewish tradition precisely what we mean. It's sometimes we talk about a written Torah because we have to qualify what we mean by Torah. There's an oral Torah, or then sometimes Torah refers to the broader sense of anything that is coming out of Jewish literature. So some people argue that Fiddler on the Roof is part of Torah because it's part of our literature. Other people say no. Some people feel it has to connect to God, and yet there's many people. I can see we've got the name of a Bialik over there, and certainly other things. God doesn't feature in their world centrally, yet Torah is very central in their world. And so we're finding ourselves already, as a Jewish people, we have what is unquestionably our foundational text. What it means and what it goes from there is something that we, to this day, as Jews, haven't reached a consensus on. If you go to a sermon in any shul, the rabbi will tell you what the consensus is. But as soon as you go to the shul down the road, the disagreement is going to continue and that ambiguity is going to continue as well there. So even at the very, very beginning, if we have to understand what we mean by Torah, we have to acknowledge that the word itself is ambiguous, and therefore there's going to be contradictions in the way different people apply to it, which for me is incredibly exciting. Because when I read a text, if I'm reading the story of Adam and Eve as part of the 5 books, written by God, or it's about the lifestyle I'm meant to lead, or it's just about our maybe Dreamtime stories I've heard some other people use for a qualification, those exact same words are going to resonate very differently. And their meaning and their implication is also going to be something very different. And so, yeah?
So Mark just suggests something that everyone actually agrees what Torah means, and that is that it's the corpus of Jewish literature, and in some contexts, I mean, the 5 books, but they disagree on what do we include in that corpus of Jewish literature.
Okay.
And that is what, meaning, and I think that's probably a fundamental difference, that we actually agree on what the word Torah is,
Mm-hmm.
but what is included as Torah, that is the source of disagreement. What do you?
All right, so you're very much falling in this category over here. It's more of a generic term, and whether fiddler should be in or out is where the negotiation needs to still work out. Fair enough there. So generally speaking, with scholars and people, that I would say that tends to be where they prefer to go, but there's certainly no consensus even around a lot of the scholarship that goes on there. So where we're going to go to is trying to understand if Torah is at some level a foundation of how Jewish tradition has evolved, understood ourselves, and the contradiction is exactly what it is there. What does it mean for who we are as Jews and how we read Torah and how it shapes us? And maybe the fact that it's a story, what does that matter? Is it a story that should influence how I think or how I should live or what I should believe? Or is it just entertainment? Is it a word of God that I should understand and follow, because if I don't follow it, I'm disagreeing with God? Or is it halakha? Ultimately, it's not about what the Torah says, it's about the laws that come out defining how we should live life. Same text, very different conclusions from the same group of people there. And so where we're going to go is look at a couple of texts, and I've made a very deliberate choice to not use original language, because I'm not going to make any presumption of where different people's knowledge bases come from. So there's how has this been photocopied for me? Okay, there's 2 pages, they haven't been stapled there. So I'm going to pass around, if you can make sure you get a couple of pages. On them is a range of texts that I'm going to suggest we play with. And feel free to make these very much your own. If you want to take, so everyone make sure they get 2 each. I'm also going to project them onto the screen. So for people who prefer not to look down but to look up, please take advantage of that. And really what I'm going to try and do is tease out the question of how this contradiction, I'm going to partly argue, is essentially what Torah is. And through there becomes what we as a Jewish people have become and how we move forward. So, I'm going to expand the text. And if at any point again someone has something to add, or I'm using a phrase or someone's using a phrase that's not clear, please do interject. Yeah.
Can I just say, could you talk about the etymology of Torah?
Beautiful. So I chose not to go there, I'm happy to go there. What was interesting for me is no one actually acknowledged the fact Torah is simply a Hebrew label, and therefore how do we translate it? Does anyone know where the word Torah explicitly comes from?
Does it come from Torah to teach?
Very much so. And alternatively, those of you in the class who are a parent, what's the Hebrew for a parent? Horeh or? Horah. Same phrase. It's this notion of being some form of a parental instructor, somewhere between, and this is where some of the tension is it authoritative or is it nurturing, in the same way as a parent is there? And we'll see within Jewish tradition we're going to be arguing about exactly what type of instruction is the Torah offering, and that's part of what I'm hoping to maybe tease out. And literally there's 1,000 other texts I could have chosen. So why I chose these ones, they worked for me when I was thinking through what to choose. So if you have others, feel free to add them. Out of curiosity, anyone when you think of Torah, is there an obvious contradiction that comes to mind that you've recognized, acknowledged, see or feel? Or is there one that you've come across or think about?
Non-Torah.
Not in Torah. As in Torah doesn't have contradictions in your thinking, or nothing pops up?
Nothing pops up.
Okay. Yeah. It's not a question you kind of go to bed thinking about and pondering through every night?
Are you saying within Torah?
Yeah, or whatever we mean by Torah. I'm curious, when you say contradictions, I'm wondering if anyone has a contradiction in
Within
mind.
the stories. Within the stories.
Like what? Can you give an example for?
Yeah. Adam,
In the first story, Adam, you guys did Bereshit,
Mhm.
the story of Adam, 2 creation stories essentially.
Okay, so for those people less familiar, the first chapter tends to use a particular name of God, tends to have things in a particular order. Go to chapter 2, different name of God, slightly different ordering and different information completely there. They don't harmonize obviously, and they stand side by side. So are they in fact 2 radically different understandings in one book, or are they the same understanding from a different prism? And that's fine. Okay, thank you. Another one?
I was going to say.
Same one. Okay. So that's great. Let's go in there. So where I'm going to move forward to, and it's very much in tune with what Ari was saying there, myjewishlearning.com, if any of you don't know it as a website, one of the reasons I choose to start there, it comes out of a college in the US called Hebrew College, whose explicit purpose is to provide Jewish understandings beyond any denomination or any agenda. So what they do is on their website have an encyclopedia of issues, but they ensure they have people from diverse viewpoints. And when they don't tell you who the author is, it's because they're trying to represent what they believe is a consensus. And of course, as soon as you put in writing, the consensus dissolves immediately. And they're okay with that there. And their whole notion of Torah and the way they framed it, which I think comes out here, is that it's broader than the books themselves, the limited concept of Torah. It can refer to all of traditional Jewish learning. We can see that coming through in our thinking there. It usually refers to Torah Shebech Tav being the scroll that's read in Shul. But there's also then the Chumash, or if otherwise the 5 books of Torah, and certainly it will continue out there. So this is loosely where I was thinking about the session, how I want to try and go through it there. And so we want to start off then is, we now have a sense of Torah, but what does the Torah mean by Torah when it uses the term itself? And the one phrase, and there's many of them, that uses from the book of Shemot, the second book in the Torah, this is one of the way it describes the origin of Torah. So what I'm going to need everyone to do at some point is to volunteer to read one of the texts aloud, so that it's not my voice going all the time. So can I have a volunteer just to read this particular text for us? Thank you.
Shemot 31:18. And God gave to Moses, when God finished talking with him on Mount Sinai, 2 tablets of testimony, tablets of stone written by the finger of God.
So from this point of view, what is the Torah suggesting it is?
He knew that Steve Jobs was going to come along and have tablets.
There you go, exactly. The classic joke is the reason Moses went up a second time was needed an upgrade, right? Anyone want to suggest me, from this particular text, what is Torah?
I mean, that verse doesn't use the word Torah.
Beautiful. First thing I want to point out is the fact that the Torah itself doesn't actually use the verse very often when describing the way we've come to think of Torah as well. Then that's a very important thing. But what insight has Jewish tradition taken from this in terms of the way it's understood what Torah is? Okay, so if we take a very literal reason, God is author, and specifically on Mount Sinai, it was at least what was handed down was 2 tablets. What we understand by 2 tablets, not every Jewish tradition is willing to agree on what that is. Certainly it's not 10 commandments, and that's the only thing I can beg you to say. 10 commandments doesn't exist in Jewish tradition anyway. 10 concepts, 10 ideas, 10 notions, and Jewish tradition normally says there's at least 14 mitzvot on these tablets. You don't need to go there again. I'm trying to just point out, we often teach 10 commandments, but it's not a Jewish concept. And Jewish tradition certainly rejects that whole notion there, because the first one is, I am Adonai your God. Is that a commandment? There's another commandment. And so we'll continue there. So over here, what I want to point out is firstly just a bit of a methodological question. If we're understanding this, most people read this from a fairly literal point of view. This is what the text said. It's pretty self-evident. God finished talking with Moses, takes God's finger, writes it down, hands it on there. Pretty clear then in terms of the ideas of Torah we came up there, which one that matches the most directly. We then move forward to the next one, and we're moving now to Talmud to get a sense of how Jewish tradition has interacted with it. Yevamot, the rabbis basically make this phrase in a number of places. This is one of the sources there. Can someone tell us what they felt Torah is? Or how we should understand what Torah is? From Yevamot, what do you think this phrase means? Torah spoke in human language, say the rabbis.
Well, to me, it means that it's speaking to us, and it's meant for us.
Okay. So target audience? It's not written for angels, it's not written for anyone else. It's written for us as human beings. What does that mean? What's the implications of that?
It means God knows how to communicate with us.
Okay, so again, in any basic communication, we know the rule is it doesn't matter how ingenious the person delivering the communication is, it's how it's received and understood that's probably more important than the actual message. So Jewish tradition very early on is acknowledging the fact that there's going to be a tension between the message and the message that's actually received and understood. And so now we have a problem. How else can humans read a sentence like this? Suddenly we have a problem, because as soon as you open Pandora's box to acknowledge that, where do you start drawing the line? So the fiddler question, of course, is one that starts off much earlier on in time. At what point is an interpretation, understanding what is Torah, just beyond the pale? And it's a contradiction that's too much for us to fathom, versus one that we actually feel comfortable with. And so the recognition of there being contradictions is something that Jewish tradition very early on is saying, as human beings, we're fallible. Any understanding we're going to bring to it, by definition, is our limitation. And in the words of Talmud, the Torah is still perfect. It's us as imperfect receivers of the message who are left to grapple with it there. But that recognition that it has to be that interaction is key. Yeah.
Do you think the time period in which we live in would have some kind of impact on how we redefine the Torah or understand certain parts of the Torah?
And I'm going to try to tease that out a lot more. What's your gut feel?
Yes.
I think we're going to see very, very clearly, by definition, a 14-year-old who reads something versus someone who's been married with children reads the same verse. There's going to be a whole different life experience they're going to bring to it there. And certainly there's going to be lots of those reasons that there's going to be differences in place there. Let's keep going, and then
Sorry,
what I-
and I just ask them,
please.
when you talk about the finger of God, you're actually making God into almost a human.
Beautiful. So one of the things I was either going to not go there is very important here. We've got a serious problem because the basic notion that Judaism has held about God is non-physical, and yet the language is extremely physical. And again, the sages throughout history are very, very clear to try and say, don't ever make that mistake. It's just metaphoric. So now we've got a problem because Jewish tradition is saying, understand the words, but they're actually symbolic. They don't mean what they appear to mean necessarily. So and so we're already now finding ourselves in this tug of war of meaning. So thank you very much for pointing that out already. Someone else had a hand up? Yeah?
Is it actually finger in Hebrew?
Absolutely, etzbah is the term that's used.
It's not a translation.
In this particular passage, it's a precise word that's used. What it means, that's going to be left up to many different interpreters to try and tease out there. So what's the Torah trying to suggest by using the notion of finger if God doesn't have finger? And so within there's a huge number of Jewish thinkers with 1,000 theories, because it's some form of, the general consensus that Jewish tradition has had up until about 300 years ago, excluding a Spinoza person, would be that somehow God is the messenger, and the message received is God's message. That generally was the consensus up until about 300 years ago. And it started to be challenged a bit, and that's part of the change of times that we'll talk about as well then. But again, for the earliest stages of Judaism, there has to be a tension because as human beings we're fallible. Yeah.
So the two actually are saying the same thing.
Which two?
The first one and the second, the Shmot and the Yevamot.
In what way are they saying the same thing?
Because if the Torah is speaking in human language, we can relate to finger. Doesn't mean that it was his finger, but it's speaking in a way that we can understand.
So what you've beautifully illustrated is rabbinic tradition early on wants to give us license to grapple with the text and not to be caught up in stuff that just seems improbable. And so there's this license up front for the fact that as human beings, we know that a finger just doesn't fit everything else that the Torah seems to argue, so therefore let's understand it symbolically, metaphorically, at some other level beyond the literal. And so we have a tension over here because at some levels, some of these words. Anyone heard anyone suggest that 2 tablets weren't given at Sinai? That seems to be a consensus that's very literally understood in the way Jewish tradition has. Finger of God is not. So in one sentence we're finding again methodological contradictions. Some of these words we're going to accept literally, some of them we have to accept metaphorically. And how do we choose which one? And so we're going to start to uncover some of the tensions that Judaism's going to completely have there. Won't spend a long time on this. A phrase that often then repeats itself through text is Ein Mukdam U'Me'achar Torah. One of the things the rabbis note, and for many people contradictions, if you treat the Torah as a history document written chronologically, it fails abysmally. And so rabbinic tradition basically makes the fact that when you read Torah, suspend time. It's not a temporal document there, and that's clearly because people must have been saying that it is. You only need to provide an interpretation like that if there's a voice suggesting, is that a possibility? So somehow there was a question up there. We can clearly see there's some things just don't stack up. If you do a timeline, there are contradictions because the story happens here, it happens over there, and they're out of order. But rabbinic tradition up front is saying, okay, we acknowledge that that is a contradiction, and we're happy to live with it by having a principle to neutralize that. And so when you find that, you'll find this phrase is coming up again and again there. So again, rabbinic tradition is not scared of acknowledging contradictions. It's how it responds to it that I think becomes interesting. And then the Jonathan Sacks room, I should have got rid of the title there, but I do feel that Jonathan Sacks speaks as the past chief rabbi of the Commonwealth of modern Orthodox Judaism, and he's quite an eloquent person there. And coming from these arguments, he has a lot to say about there. Can someone read for us Jonathan Sacks' words in terms of how he handles on these tensions? Thank you.
Truth on earth is not nor can be the whole truth. It is limited, not comprehensive. particular, not universal. When two propositions conflict, it is not necessarily because one is true, the other false. It may be, and often is, that each represents a different perspective on reality, an alternative way of structuring order, no more and no less commensurable than a Shakespearean sonnet, a Michelangelo painting, or a Schubert sonata. In heaven there is truth, on earth there are truths. Therefore, each culture has something to contribute. Each person knows something no one else does. The sages said, "Who is wise? One who learns from all men and women."
And I deliberately chose not to go his language because the question is raised, how do we read it when you're in a different time there? And I think most people in 2016 see that last statement as ironic in its translation. And you'll find in many school texts, I don't know what Carmel does, when we translate, it's one who learns from all people. And that's just the case there because the Hebrew is written in masculine plural, which can be inclusive beyond that there. And so that's an issue that we grapple with that was not really an issue regarded earlier on in Jewish history there. But Jonathan Sachs is choosing to translate in this particular way. I give him permission to do so. What do you say his whole argument about the fact that contradictions must exist? What does he think about that? Sorry?
It's very postmodern.
Absolutely, it's postmodern. What makes you say that, though?
Because he's saying there's not one truth. There is only truth for Hashem in heaven, but for us on earth, everyone comes to understand the world through their experience and their culture and their relationships to each other. So there's only perspectives. Our way of seeing is dictated by the way, what we see is dictated by how we see.
Anyone else want to add to that? That was great. Does he have a problem with the contradictions? As in understandings that appear to be completely opposite to one another? He has no problem with that. He actually calls it in one of his texts. He calls it that Judaism has textual pluralism. There's no problem with the fact that there are blatantly differing viewpoints. That's inherent. That's not his issue. And everyone want to guess where his issue becomes the problem?
You don't learn from it.
For him, learning is essentially a part of it. That's key there. Learning is not an issue for him. He's very comfortable with learning through contradiction. Where does he draw the line, though? This text doesn't give you a clue. For him, he draws the line at this word over here. He says you can think whatever you want to think. You can learn and study what you do. But when it comes to behaving, Judaism needs uniformity of behavior. And so for him, from the way he's reconciling it, representing his movement, the reason you have halakha is not to discredit alternate viewpoints, but to create norms on the ground. And that for him, norms cohere community, and he will then argue that's been historically the way Judaism has managed itself there. So from a pretty authoritative person within, speaking for a large group of Commonwealth Jews at any rate there, this notion of contradiction again is something that is deemed and recognised as being inherent, significant, and we do know that he got into trouble in his own home country for some of these viewpoints. Those of you know the story? In essence, he was forced to rewrite a chapter of his book when he suggested that other religions have an equally authentic truth. And the politics of his British community, which they imagine again what Clive may have been referencing.
You talk about the boring British story?
That one, exactly that. The ultra-Orthodox community is less comfortable with that mindset and actually threatened to withdraw support for him in his role as chief rabbi unless he changed it. So anyone who has a first edition is regarded as having a prize, because the second edition onwards has removed that assertion, even though I think one can see where he stands and how easily that viewpoint flows. But there's something else in here that is quite challenging, which I certainly know I've been to many Jewish communities that find this very, very problematic. What has more truth in it, Shakespeare's sonnet or Torah?
Is truth relative?
Sorry?
Is truth relative? So they have different truths.
Okay, so from his viewpoint, isn't it interesting? It's no less than a Shakespeare sonnet. How does that sound? How feel? Our Torah is as valid in the truth that it perpetuates as Shakespeare.
If you look upon it from the perspective of God having given a gift to that person, it's all part of God.
And he'll go on to describe a lot more of that. Absolutely, that's his viewpoint, yeah?
Sorry, I think he's saying that people can have ideas about the truth and what their truth is, or some ideological truth, but
he's ultimately saying that you might think the Shakespeare sonnet, the Michelangelo painting, the Schubert, or equal in their perspective, but he's not. Yes, the rabbi is not saying that that the Torah is not the ultimate truth. He hasn't backed away from that at all. He said truth on earth. But his position ultimately is that the Torah is from Hashem. It's not from earth. It's not created by man. So men may have truths, but God has truth.
That's a key line. There's certainly, he has no problem in saying depth of understanding can come from almost anywhere through human, honest exploration and creativity. But specifically, and he'll go on and say, our truth comes from our source. Someone else's truth comes from their source, and so the whole notion of chosenness, and there's a philosopher Albor who basically argues that like an ecosystem today, where every single animal has a distinctive contribution, and you remove one animal, the whole ecosystem is diminished. So it is with human beings on the planet Earth. And the reason we are chosen is different to the reason that every other group is chosen. And so it's an equal choosing in that particular sense there. But for us, we have to own up, he would say, to this truth. And within this truth is the fact that it's the voice of humanity trying to grapple with the voice of God, recognizing we're limited by our own fallibility. And so we now have to try to figure out where it is there. So that's certainly his way of reconciling it. Have some of you heard of Nechama Leibowitz? Again, one of the people I think who personifies this concept magnificently. She was one of the most exquisite scholars of Torah in its broader sense. Comes from a family of enormous prestige. Unquestionably in the Israeli society would be what we might call more modern Orthodox. No two ways about, absolute commitment to devotion, with a level of understanding that was encyclopedic, genius, poetic, magnificent. She's created a whole methodology by answering people in her living room about what text means. She would be furious with me right now because she would say you cannot understand Torah through interpretation. You have to grapple with the Hebrew. It was written in Hebrew for a reason, and if you choose to step away from the Hebrew, you miss it there. But we acknowledge that that's a limitation of what I'm doing over here there. But she will often tell the story, recognize the fact she became famous because she wrote answers to people's Torah questions around the world. They were then collated and published as books there because of remarkable insight. And she'll often tell the story that the person she learned some most insightful text for was a taxi driver. Why? He commented on something about life and he mentioned something about a parasha she had never in her life considered or seen it in traditional rabbinic texts, but no less puts it as equally valid. And so we can see in terms of where this notion has come from is where do you draw the line? Do we feel comfortable a taxi driver who clearly had some level of connection to Jewish tradition is now an equal authority in her mind? She also will quote Shakespeare to give insight into what Torah means. There's no problem. And she'll quote all the traditional texts with ridiculous ease and fluency there. So, yeah.
I think you also once said that 70 faces of the Torah, but there's not 71. In other words, if you have an interpretation, some interpretations just don't make sense. You have to be standards.
And absolutely. The challenge that I think up front a lot of people have come up with already is we've got to draw the line somewhere. It's not 6 books, it's 5 books. It's lifestyle, but not everything goes. And so this is the challenge we have all along. Fiddler or not fiddler? And who gets to decide what the outlier is? And I think in there we have a major contradiction that goes on, which I would suggest is why Jewish community will never be singular in its mindset. Because apparently we like arguments. We like disagreement. And I would argue that our culture doesn't give us that choice. If we immerse ourselves into this type of thinking, by definition, contradiction is in essence who we are and who we have been and where we'll continue to go. Some people are less comfortable with contradiction than others, so some are determined to harmonise it. Other people live within it, and other people find it too stressful, so they leave it alone completely. And this is part of the dynamic through Jewish history, and certainly within the modern or postmodern time, we struggle even more there. One more text that's quite famous, I just think getting a sense of how intrinsic this notion is and how some of the lines are drawn. Can someone read for us this Pirkei Avot passage, which is from Mishnah, otherwise known as Oral, or Oral Torah, I should say. Torah Shabbat. Someone hasn't read one who would volunteer? Thank you.
From Pirkei Avot 5:17. Every argument that is for the sake of heaven's name, it is destined to endure. But if it is not for the sake of heaven's name, it is not destined to endure. What is an example of an argument for the sake of heaven's The argument of Hillel and Shammai. What is an example of an argument not for the sake of heaven's name? The argument of Korah and all his followers.
Anyone want to share who Hillel and Shammai are, their arguments? Yeah.
Didn't Hillel say you can learn the Torah in one week?
In fact, that's a beautiful. So the full story that takes place with this one, which I think is a nice taste of who they are. This man walks up to Shammai and says, "Hey, I want to learn all of Torah." Again, he doesn't define what he means by Torah. Standing on one foot. Shammai takes a building ruler and chases him out of there, literally smacking him on the head in the way that these days you'd have to call community services, basically telling him how completely insolent can you be, suggesting Torah can be learned in one foot. The guy then goes whimpering, I'm assuming, to Hillel. Same thing, and Hillel says, don't do unto others that which you don't want to yourself. The rest is commentary, go and study. Shammai tends to come from a wealthy family. He would be the equivalent of today's terms of a, I'm scared of which political party to try and compare to, because I'm not perfect there. But let's say I think him and Trump may have had some commonalities in their economic worldview, in the sense that if you empower the wealthy, the rest of society gets carried along. Hillel was a pauper growing up, and he represents the more small L liberal mindset and really believes in compassion in a lot of ways there. What the Talmud goes to say, despite their vehement disagreements, they still married one another's families. That's what we mean an argument of Hillel and Shammai. They absolutely were adamant that I think in the Talmud, I think it's about 3 times, I may get the number wrong, someone else may know there, the rabbis chose to side with Hillel's side of the argument, not discrediting Shammai. They basically say in the next world will be his turn, but they kind of felt that compassion needs to be the way that we manage ourselves there. Major schools of thought. It's not surprising for those who know anything about American jury, you've never seen a Shammai house on a university campus. They've chosen to nominate Hillel because he's still the favourite son there, because his rulings are, there's many beautiful stories about his sense of compassion and getting over there. And then Korach.
Korah questions Moses and God through Moses and says, aren't we all equal? Why are you greater than the rest of us? It's a bit of a problem, because it also says, aren't we supposed to be a kingdom of priests? So why are you more of a priest than the rest of us? Korah and his followers get swallowed up by the ground.
The ground yawns, they say bye-bye, and they move down there. So a pretty fierce comment that the Torah is suggesting in terms of the validity of that argument. An argument you've heard any other time in history?
Grappled with it.
And rabbinic tradition has grappled with it too. And the general consensus, and is by no means anywhere near a complete consensus, it's not what the argument was, it was how it was done. In other words, it wasn't done with dignity in mind, it was done with complete self-focus and absorption, and in that completely diminished community. Where Moshe, with all his mistakes, always tried to put community first, except for when his temper got in the way and a few other foibles that made him very, very human there. So here we can see, I think, what is really trying to draw the line there. We can't tell at the face of it which argument is okay. We have to give it time to endure. And the outcome of the argument will give us insight later on there. Which therefore, what does it mean for the argument we're having right now, well, in 5 minutes' time? Valid or invalid? And as it starts to play out, the test of time will ultimately let us know whether it's one that's going to be appropriate or inappropriate. We're not so brilliant that we can tell in the moment, and that applies for even the sages of Hillel and Shammai. Which is why I always say to students in the classroom, if you ever get told this is what it should mean, you say to the person, fair enough, in 5 years' time let's discuss it again. Because there's no reason to try and deal with Korach, who's dealing according to Jewish tradition in the here and the now and the absolute. We have to give things time to play themselves out before they start to reveal themselves there. So we've seen the notion, again, for me, contradiction is something that Jewish tradition has not shied away from, but struggled with, because we have to draw limits somewhere in the list. Anyone else have any other comments for that? All right, I'm going to go walk into Torah a little bit now. And what I'm going to ask you to do is something different. These are 2 passages from what are badly called the 10 Commandments. The Torah calls it the Luchot HaBrit, the tablets of the covenant, or Aseret Devarim, the 10 phrases there. And this happens to be what we loosely count as the 4th of the phrases there. They take place in 2 books. I didn't do left to right for any particular reason. What I'm going to ask you to do with the person sitting next to you, same story. Moses goes up to Sinai, comes down with tablets. This is the content of the tablets. Read them with the person next to you. Any contradictions? Any concerns? Anything you notice? And let's see if you can share. So again, just contextually, God says, hey Moses, go up to Sinai, I'll give you the tablets. Moses takes version 1.0, comes down, has a fairly severe rage issue. These days there's a whole form of therapy that I would suspect he would have to go through. In a workplace it would be completely unacceptable. Consequence lands up being, get back up there, and God says, this time I'm going to tell you the words, but you actually write them yourself. So this is the one written by the finger of God according to tradition. This is the one written by Moses but dictated by God. It's the same one. Seems like a reasonable consequence to me. If you break something, you go and you recreate yourself there. And so, theoretically, Moses is receiving the same message on top of Mount Sinai to bring down to the people. This is the first one slipped out of his hands. What are some of the things that you've noticed? Yeah.
Marathon and I. So we have these three things that we do.
Maybe share one and we'll come around to everything.
That one is keep, the one to remember.
So here we even have an issue what the opening point is about there. And keep is again one of those unhelpful English things of the Hebrew shamor, which also has a sense of guard, protect. We don't know exactly how to translate it to English, so it's that type of notion there, where this is very much about the notion of remembering. Same thing, different thing. How do you remember something versus how do you protect something or guard it or... So we can think about what that is. What else is another... Yeah?
Yeah, the reason in the Shemot version is to do God created the world in 6 days, but then in the other ones He brought us out of the land of Egypt, where we were slaves.
And for those of you who know Shabbat Kiddush, that's where it's come from there. This is connected. The reason we do Shabbat is because of 6 days of creation. That's the story that normally gets told to kids. But a lot of people actually forget the fact that the other reason that our Torah makes explicit is the reason we must celebrate Shabbat is because we were once in the land of Egypt, now we're not. So the rationale, so firstly what we're meant to do is starting to shift, and the rationale for doing so seems to come from 2 different points. Any other, before we try and deal with the observations, what are some others you noticed?
Well, each one is blessing the Shabbat day, and in Bryan it's commanding at the bottom.
So where are we? So we've got over here there, God commands you to shamor the Shabbat. We're over here, it's...
Blessed.
And because God did these things, God gave you a blessing, and that's what God does as opposed to what we meant to do. So we can see in terms of who the actor is, there also seems to be a bit of a contradiction, for lack of a better word right now. Anything else?
Tavarium's a bit more socialist. In that the manservant and the maidservant can rest as well as you. So you have a good rest, they should have a good rest as well.
As opposed to?
It just says they should rest. Just as all on that one, it just says you shall not do any work. Your manservant or your maidservant. But in Varim, it's very clear that the manservant and the maidservant may rest as well as you.
So one hand it's you shall not do work, but the rest I'm trying to just catch up with you.
A bit further down, right? That your manservant, there, there.
That you may rest as well as you.
Yes, that they may rest as well as you.
So there's an equality of any living entity in your household.
Yeah.
Clearly it's not about just Jewish and non-Jewish, because the presumption is servants are not there, but the fact that one's animals get the same level of recognition. Where over here we're only getting the opportunity of stopping from work. So the expectation on us is now starting to be, again, I'm not going to assume it's all a contradiction, but it's definitely not identical.
And it's also that stopping from work and resting are actually different. Actually very different.
And we could probably have an hour session just trying to make sense of these over here, and that's one of the reasons I chose it there. So, yeah.
But do you not think the context of the book makes would impact on the boy? Because this Shemot, they've just come out of Egypt.
Yeah.
And presumably they were keeping a form of Shabbat, maybe when they were in Egypt, because the concept does seem to be familiar to them. They didn't say, oh, what's that? Whereas in the Varim, Moshe has, well, the story of Moshe has, assembled all the Jewish people. It's been 40 years. This is a new generation about to enter Israel.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a bit more specific because of...
I'm not going to argue with you, I just want to point out what Jewish tradition is going to say to you. What are you doing? You're following the obvious trap, right?
Yeah, but everyone would agree that the leaving Egypt came before entering Israel.
except it's understood. How many days does Jewish tradition say the 2 tablets were given apart? We only deal with the month, basically, plus a bit, right? So again, so what you're raising is absolutely brilliant. Is there, from the way the texts are read, it appears that maybe what was being accentuated, one was at the end of the journey 40 years later, where another one suggests was given 40 days later.
And to a new generation of people, because the previous generation couldn't enter Israel, they all died in the desert, so it's presumably their children. So it is, to a degree, it is a different target audience. It could even be those people who hadn't left Egypt themselves. So with Shemot, there's no point telling people, you left Egypt. They know they've left Egypt, whereas their kids may need a reminder.
So let's step a little bit outside of that, because what we're struggling with now is the Torah is telling us God gave us these things to tell the Jewish people, and this is the foundation of everything. And now we're stuck with, how do we harmonise the fact that they're clearly different? In other words, I think the challenge, and I'll come to 1 second, is are we comfortable saying some contradictions at the very least coexist? Or is there a way to rationalise them so in fact they don't really contradict, they're just different? Does that mean God changes God's mind about what we should do or what we think? Or is God speaking? Jewish tradition's also going to struggle with this, because only by carving context, and there will be those that say this was given 40 days apart. And there are going to be others that are going to say, well, it's Moses retelling it to another generation, and their memories, by definition, need to hear the message through their life experience, not through the life experience of their parents or grandparents. And so certainly a lot of my point, rather than trying to see with how Jewish tradition resolves this is a classic example of, and there's many examples like this, especially in Devarim, because Devarim is written as if it's Moses' recount of everything that happens, and either Moses has forgotten, deliberately twisting the truth some of the times, or maybe there's something else going on completely and we don't want to be so cynical about Moses or what's going on there. And within that space there we have to make sense there. So that's the one area where the Torah has actually ample number of contradictions, where we're going to have Devarim through Moses' viewpoint versus what's happening in the other parts of the Torah, which is not necessarily given through his viewpoint as well there. So I want to move on over there, because I think the one that many Jews don't realise that is one of the most favoured songs that is taught in early childhood education. Anyone know who Shlomo Alphabet is? How many of you have ever sung the Chadudi? Look at the first letter of each of the verses. The first one is Shamor, stands for Shlomo. He's the author, and he started every verse with the letters of his name. And what he does is give voice to what is a fairly normative rabbinic response to try and harmonise, and he turns around and says, what's going on? Someone want to read it for us?
Observe and remember, so faith. The only God calls us to hear in a single utterance. The Lord is one, and his name is one, to be renowned and his glory and his praise.
In other words, from Alphabet's point of view, what actually took place? 2 different versions, or?
At the same time.
This is God. Why should God speak in a singular voice like human beings? God gave both messages simultaneously, and the one tablet captured the one version, the other one. And therefore an attempt to try and harmonise, and Jewish tradition, there's no contradiction per se, 2 dimensions of the same thing. And so we can talk to when was this given, was it the audience, or maybe it's about the way God delivers there. That's us trying to deal with contradiction within our community. And it's within those arguments we start to devise meaning, and therefore it doesn't matter these days if you're in a Reconstructionist, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Ultra-Orthodox, other shul, this happens to be words that every single one of those communities sing every single Friday night. And yet we can see why many of those communities have serious difficulty with those, and others will just find them completely inadequate. But it's become part of our folk in a sense there. And so we're going, so next time you sing the Chadudi, look for those first letters, and you'll always be reminded who the author is there and why he felt a need to begin his song with that particular issue there. Yeah?
For me, there is still this difference, and something happened in that period. So the second one is just much more prescriptive. So not just remember, actually you have to do that and that. It's not. And also put it in a context that the people that are hearing it understands better. Must something that is more relevant to them.
And I think I heard one person say to was beautiful is that that difference proves how mean God can be. One, God gave Moses the short version to have to write, but I have to give the expanded one too. So how and the meaning we put around these differences can give us lots of insights and going things there. But it's within that grappling, I suggest, is where the greatest amount of wisdom starts to reveal itself. And so I'm going to move through these ones fairly quickly. Just another sample of how we find ourselves. We read the text and we reconcile absolutely beautifully with one text until we find an identical parallel text in so many ways, where the way we reconcile no longer is satisfactory for the next text. So again, we'll do this fairly quickly because I don't spend a large amount of time on these ones there. Can someone just read for us what's going on over here? And
while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Shabbat day. And they that found him gathering sticks brought him unto Moses and Aaron, and unto all the congregation. And they put him in ward, because it had not been declared what should be done to him. And the Eternal said unto Moses, the man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp.
So I'm just going to stop over there.
Outside.
How many of you said comfortable with this?
Comfortable.
Yeah? Anyone comfortable with this?
No.
Just checking.
No.
Why not?
Going to stone someone.
Very.
But hold on, whose words are these?
Go on.
We're finding ourselves now with an intellectual contradiction in a sense there. The modern day values, and this is the point I think was so beautifully made there, for us as a modern reader to try and make sense of a community that will endorse us, let's face it, we spend more time throwing stones at each other than anything else. And we can certainly know of the isolated incident in some sectors of Israeli society who've taken this to heart. Part of the issue is very simply, was this an instruction just for that moment in time, or is it an eternal instruction? And that's another contradiction we have, is some of the mitzvot are understood to be the here and the now only, and some for all time. So this and then I've heard a lot of people rationalize this to say, look, in the day and age, what does it take to build a fire compared to electricity today? What is a person physically doing by going out of their way on Shabbat in order to build a fire? What do they have to do?
Turn the switch.
Back in the day.
Yeah.
What do they do? Think about what it's like. You're sitting in your camp, and the one person decides to make a fire. What do they do?
Well, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
We're in the desert, aren't we?
That's right.
Now, my understanding of the desert, my memories of the desert, are there aren't too many trees that you can chop down.
Let's not deal with
There aren't
logic
too
right
many
now. Let's
sticks-
just...
But there aren't too many sticks to find, so you've got to go quite a long way to find anything that you can burn.
The point is, the person is essentially choosing to leave the camp. And this, a lot of people have said they come to understanding this because in the day and age, it was the equivalent of leaving the community. On one hand, the idiot makes himself vulnerable to the forces out there, and that's unfair for the community to have to deal with that. On the other hand, the person is possibly choosing to leave the community behind. And there's many other reasons that people come to rationalise. The one I've never heard one that becomes comfortable is this one over here. Similar concept of where death penalty plays out. I certainly, as a parent, feel this way sometimes. You can decide if any of you have any clue what I'm talking about. Can someone else read for us this passage? Someone hasn't read it. Thank you.
If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son, who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who after they have scolded him, still will not listen to them, then his father and his mother shall lay hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city and to the gate of his place. And they shall say to the elders of his city, our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. And all the men of his city shall stone him with stones, then he shall die. So you shall get rid of evil away from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear.
Anyone has a relationship with kids that have felt like wanting to do this? Any of you felt comfortable being in a community that actually would imagine carrying this out?
Yeah.
What do you think about the fact that we as a Jewish people have the finger of God and we're instructed to do this? How does that sit? Again, we're seeing this value contradiction that's struggling, and I think what's key in terms of how we as the audience have to try and understand text there, and this is where modern criterion go. What I've got here, which I won't tap into, you're welcome to read there, rabbinic tradition hates this one.
Right,
This one
sorry.
is, yeah?
Am I right in saying that the rebellious son, that never actually happened?
What you are doing is trying to harmonise the contradiction, I would argue, to the way rabbinic tradition is trying to come to terms with it.
Okay.
For whatever reason, this has sat okay, was understandable. where there's no part in Jewish tradition that is ever like this. So much so, and here's but one example, the rabbis create a halachic response to it that mean it never actually can be implemented. And so that the way that they do it, as you can see over here very, very briefly, is they focus on this particular Sanhedrin passage there, focuses on what the parents have to do. They lay hold of him, bring him to the elders, and they have to, and they say, our son is, in other words, how are they saying that?
Together.
B'dibur echad, the same as Alphabet says about the tablets. They have to sound like a singular being in a singular way. And is that ever feasible?
No.
So therefore it was there to teach us that a child who is a rebel and a glutton and basically doesn't give basic honor to the parents, it's like they deserve to never have been born or deserve to be having... I'm not even going to try and deal with the issue of labelling a child as evil and all those things, which a contemporary audience is going to grapple with in a lot of ways there. So where we coming to again is the contradictions we can't ignore. A, they've been recognised by Jewish tradition for the last 3,000 years, and we've never tried to hide from them. Some of them is the fact that literal words sometimes are very nice, except for when they're not. Symbolic interpretations are very satisfactory until you move beyond the pale of what is suddenly acceptable within the pale. And so we keep on finding ourselves as a Jewish tradition with this dynamic of trying to reconcile or allow contradiction to speak for itself. And that's really where I want us to leave here thinking. What I am going to do is I'm not going to deal with the Acher, which is a gorgeous story all by itself there. Through some of the exquisite conversations I managed to have while I've been in Perth, this is a text many people know. I'll figure out how to expand this there. I don't have it here, but it's all over the internet, and you need that phrase, Tanur shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai. And this is a famous Talmudic thing, which I think is maybe more poignant than the one I was going to choose initially. In short of what's happening is two major figures, Rabbi Joshua and Eliezer, are having a huge halachic argument that I anticipate most of you have had in your own household. And that is whether the clay oven that they use, I'm trying to just see how to... There we go. Is that a bit better?
Yeah.
Basically, whether this clay oven is sufficiently kosher for the particular needs. And they're in arguments, right? The Talmud, we know, is a collation of minutes of argument after argument, most of which are never reconciled in the Talmud itself. And so, very, very simply what ends up happening there, Eliezer basically says he brings all the evidence, because there's a halachic argument saying the Torah, basically, to the Word of God, backs the fact that what I say is the right thing. But Rabbi Joshua, who's the other major figure at the time, basically turns and says, no, sorry, we don't accept it. Never gives a reason, never explains himself, but talking as the authority of the community just says no. So Eliezer says, okay, if I can't convince you through showing you what the text actually says, I'm going to go a bit beyond it. And says, I'm going to get the carob tree to prove it to you. And lo and behold, the carob tree jumps up, replants itself elsewhere there. There's someone else on my side here, guys, and Joshua says, carob trees don't persuade me. Okay, then let the stream prove it. And lo and behold, the stream starts flowing uphill, and Joshua says, yeah, so what? That doesn't do it. And it continues with a few extra things. The final stage of it is that the house that they're in, the war starts conquering, and Joshua says it's enough already, and they stop. And Talmud says that they remain that way as a way of showing both sides of the argument. And basically, he says, I don't care if... the next step of it then is, Eliezer says, okay, God, can you please tell me who's right? We argue about what you want of us. And lo and behold, God turns around and says, guys, why are you arguing with Eliezer? I mean, seriously, I've made the carob tree jump. I've defied nature more than once yet. Don't you get it? And the response of the rabbis? God, who invited you? The Torah is no longer in heaven. It's our issue to deal with. Jewish law says that we've come up with, you have to abide by the majority. He's the minority, he's not accepting that. Not interested. At which point the Talmud goes a step further and says, the angels ask God, so tell me, what were you thinking at the time? I said, can't laugh, my children have defeated me. The challenge of what it is to be Torah, we can't even agree to what the word means. We certainly can't agree to what the words within the Torah means. But my suggestion is it's in that dialogue where Jewish tradition starts to create itself and always has, rather than in the solution. And there's always going to be people in our community who find contradictions stressful and unhelpful and are going to adamantly need to reconcile and to take you along for their answer. There are others who love contradiction And there are others who find it so uncomfortable that actually no longer want to be part of the conversation. Because it's much easier to read a self-help book for $16 that can tell me how to make my life better. So I asked the question at the very beginning, contradiction in the Torah, what does it mean? I'm going to let you answer that for yourselves. Thank you all very much.